The crack of the whip echoed through the pine-scented mountain air like a gunshot, followed by a cry of pain that made Ezra Blackwood's jaw clench tight enough to crack teeth. He'd been tracking the slave traders for 3 days, following their trail through the high country of the Colorado Territory, but he hadn't expected to find them camped in his own valley, the hidden sanctuary he'd called home for the past 5 years. From his position behind a massive boulder, Ezra could see the entire scene laid out below him like something from his worst nightmares. 4 white men in dirty clothes and cruel faces had made camp beside the stream that ran through the valley floor. Their horses were picketed nearby, along with a string of pack mules loaded with supplies and trade goods. But it was the 5th figure that made Ezra's blood run cold. Chained to a sturdy pine tree was the largest woman he'd ever seen, easily 6.5 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and powerful build of a warrior. Her long black hair hung in tangled waves around a face that would have been beautiful if not for the bruises and cuts that marked her bronze skin. She wore the remnants of traditional Apache clothing, now torn and stained, and iron shackles around her wrists and ankles that had rubbed her skin raw. "Get up, you red devil," snarled the man with the whip, a thin, weasel-faced character with yellowed teeth and cruel eyes. "Time for your evening entertainment." The woman, for despite her size, there was no mistaking her gender, raised her head with defiant pride. When she spoke, her voice was deep and rich, carrying clearly in the mountain air despite the obvious pain she was in. "I am Ayana of the Chiricahua Apache," she said in accented but clear English. "Daughter of Chief Mangas Coloradas, sister to warriors, granddaughter of chiefs. I do not dance for dogs." The whip cracked again, this time finding its mark across her shoulders. Ayana's body jerked with the impact, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she straightened to her full, impressive height and stared at her tormentor with eyes that promised death. "You'll dance, or you'll bleed," the weasel-faced man said. "Makes no difference to me. The buyers in Santa Fe pay the same either way." Ezra had heard enough. He'd spent the last 5 years in these mountains trying to forget the violence and cruelty of the world below, but some things couldn't be ignored. Some lines couldn't be crossed, not while he still drew breath. Moving with the silent grace that had kept him alive through 2 wars and countless battles, Ezra worked his way around the camp's perimeter. His Sharps rifle was in his hands, a weapon he knew as well as his own heartbeat, and his Colt Navy revolver rode easy on his hip. 4 men against 1 wasn't great odds, but Ezra had faced worse. The first shot took the man with the whip in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him into the stream with a splash that sent the camp's horses into a panic. The second shot, fired before the echo of the first had faded, caught another slaver as he reached for his rifle. "What the hell?" one of the survivors shouted, diving for cover behind a fallen log. "Mountain man," the 4th man yelled. "Told you we shouldn't have come up here." Ezra worked the lever of his rifle and put a bullet into the log inches from the hidden man's head, sending splinters flying. "You boys picked the wrong valley to set up shop," he called out, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone of a man who'd killed before and would kill again. "Drop your weapons and ride out, and you might live to see tomorrow." "Go to hell," came the shouted reply, followed by a wild shot that went wide by 20 feet. Ezra sighed and settled in for a proper fight. These weren't the first slave traders he'd encountered in the territory, and they probably wouldn't be the last. The practice was officially illegal, but enforcement was spotty at best, and there was always a market for exotic slaves in the more lawless parts of the Southwest. The battle was brief but vicious. The slavers had numbers, but Ezra had position, skill, and righteous anger on his side. When the smoke cleared 10 minutes later, all 4 men were dead, and the mountain valley had returned to its usual peaceful quiet. Ezra emerged from cover cautiously, his rifle ready, but there was no more fight left in the slavers. He walked slowly toward the tree, where the Apache woman was chained, noting how she watched his approach with wary intelligence. Even bound and beaten, she radiated a dangerous strength that made him approach with respect. "Easy there," he said softly, the same tone he'd use with a wounded animal. "I'm not here to hurt you." Ayana's dark eyes studied him with fierce intensity. He was a big man himself, 6 feet 4 inches of lean muscle and weathered leather, with shoulder-length brown hair and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. His clothes were simple frontier wear, well-made but practical, and his weapons were clean and well-maintained. Most importantly, his blue-gray eyes held none of the cruel hunger she'd seen in her captors. "You killed them," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes, ma'am, I did." Ezra knelt beside the nearest dead slaver and began searching for keys to her shackles. "Couldn't stand by and watch what they were doing to you. Why?" The simple question made Ezra pause in his search. Why indeed? He'd come to these mountains to escape the world and its problems, to live alone with his memories and his guilt. Getting involved in other people's troubles was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. "Because it was wrong," he said finally, finding a ring of keys in the weasel-faced man's pocket. "Because you're a human being, and no human being deserves to be treated like an animal." Ayana watched as he approached with the keys, her body tense and ready to fight despite her chains. "You could sell me yourself. Apache slaves bring good money in Santa Fe." Ezra met her eyes steadily as he unlocked the shackles around her wrists. "I could, but I won't. Soon as I get these chains off you, you're free to go wherever you want." The iron cuffs fell away with a metallic clatter, and Ayana rubbed her raw wrists, wincing at the pain. When Ezra moved to unlock the ankle shackles, she could have easily overpowered him, even injured. She was incredibly strong, and he was in a vulnerable position. Instead, she remained still, studying this strange white man who'd killed 4 men to free a woman he'd never met. "What is your name?" she asked, as the last shackle fell away. "Ezra Blackwood," he replied, stepping back to give her space. "And you're Ayana, daughter of Chief Mangus Coloradas, if I heard right. You know of my father?" Ezra's expression darkened. "I know he was murdered by white soldiers under a flag of truce. I know it was one of the most dishonorable acts in a war full of dishonorable acts." He gestured toward his cabin, barely visible through the trees on the far side of the valley. "You're welcome to rest, get cleaned up, take whatever supplies you need. There's a trail that leads down to Apache country about 10 miles south of here." Ayana rose to her full impressive height, and Ezra had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes. She was magnificent, tall and strong and proud, with the bearing of a warrior princess despite her ordeal. The torn clothing couldn't hide her feminine curves, and the bruises couldn't diminish the fierce beauty of her face. "You live here alone?" she asked, looking around the hidden valley with its clear stream, rich grass, and protective ring of mountains. 5 years now. It's peaceful, mostly. Lonely." Ezra shrugged. "I prefer it that way." Ayana studied him for a long moment, seeing something in his weathered face that spoke of old pain and carefully guarded solitude. "You are running from something, aren't we all?" Before Ayana could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed off the valley walls. Ezra's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, but Ayana held up a restraining hand. "Apache," she said, her head tilted as she listened to the rhythm of the hoofbeats. "Many riders, coming fast. Friends of yours?" "My brother," Ayana said, and for the first time since he'd found her, she smiled. "Naiche has been tracking me." Within minutes, the valley was filled with Apache warriors, 24 of the finest horsemen Ezra had ever seen, led by a young man who bore a strong resemblance to Ayana despite being nearly a foot shorter. The warriors spread out in a classic battle formation, their weapons ready, their dark eyes taking in the scene of carnage with professional interest. The leader, Naiche, Ezra assumed dismounted and strode toward his sister with obvious relief. The reunion was brief but emotional, conducted in rapid Apache that Ezra couldn't follow. Then Naiche turned his attention to the white man who stood calmly beside the bodies of 4 slave traders. "You are the one who freed my sister?" Naiche asked in English nearly as good as Ayana's. I am. These men, you killed them all? They needed killing. Naiche walked among the bodies, noting the precise placement of the bullet wounds, the tactical skill that had allowed one man to defeat four. When he looked back at Ezra, there was respect in his dark eyes. I am Naiche, war chief of the Chiricahua Apache, son of Cochise, brother to Ayana. You have done my family a great service, white man. Ezra Blackwood. And I did what anyone should have done, but most would not have. Naiche replied, most white men would have ridden away or tried to claim my sister for themselves. He paused, studying Ezra's face. You ask for no reward, no payment for her return. None needed. She's free to go where she pleases. Ayana stepped forward, speaking rapidly to her brother in Apache. Ezra caught a few words his name, references to the fight, something that sounded like an argument. Naiche's eyebrows rose as his sister spoke, and he glanced several times at Ezra with an expression that was hard to read. Finally, Naiche held up a hand for silence. My sister tells me interesting things about you, Ezra Blackwood. She says you live alone in this valley, that you are skilled in war but seek peace, that you freed her without thought of reward or recognition. All true enough. She also says, Naiche continued with what might have been the ghost of a smile, that you are unmarried, that you treat her with respect despite her unusual size, and that this valley would be a good place to raise strong children. Ezra felt heat rise in his cheeks as he began to understand where this conversation was heading. Now hold on. Among my people, Naiche interrupted, when a warrior performs a great service for a family, it creates obligation. When that warrior saves the life of an unmarried woman, especially one who has been difficult to find a husband for, the obligation becomes more specific. Ayana stepped forward, her dark eyes meeting Ezra's with an intensity that made his breath catch. I am 26 winters old, white man. I am taller and stronger than most men of my tribe. I have been trained as a warrior, and I speak my mind freely. No Apache man wants a wife who can defeat him in combat. Ayana, Naiche began, but she silenced him with a look. I have watched you, Ezra Blackwood, she continued. You are not afraid of my size or my strength. You killed 4 men to free a stranger, asking nothing in return. You live in this beautiful place like a man at peace with himself and the world. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. I think perhaps the spirits brought us together for a reason. Ezra stared at her, his mind reeling. In the space of an hour, he'd gone from living as a hermit to being propositioned by an Apache warrior princess who stood 6.5 feet tall and could probably break him in half if she chose to. Ma'am, he said carefully, I'm honored by your interest, but you don't know anything about me. I'm not a good man, Ayana. I've done things. We have all done things, she interrupted. The question is not what we have done, but what we choose to do now. Naiche stepped forward, his expression serious. There is more you should know, white man. My sister is not just any Apache woman. She is the daughter of Mangus Coloradas, granddaughter of chiefs, keeper of ancient bloodlines. Among our people, she island, special. Special how? Ayana answered for herself, I am what your people might call a medicine woman, though that is not quite right. I have gifts, visions, sometimes healing knowledge, the ability to see into men's hearts. Her dark eyes seemed to look straight through him. I see pain in you, Ezra Blackwood, old pain, carefully hidden. You came to these mountains to escape something that haunts you. Ezra felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under her penetrating gaze. That's none of your concern. It is if you are to be my husband. I never said, you saved my life, Ayana said simply. By Apache law, that creates a bond between us. By the law of my heart. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. I have had visions of a tall white man with sad eyes who would come from the mountains to change my fate. I believe that man is you." Ezra looked around at the circle of Apache warriors, all watching this exchange with intense interest. He thought about his solitary life in the valley, about the peace he'd found in isolation, about the reasons he'd fled civilization in the first place. Then he looked at Ayana, magnificent, proud, beautiful Ayana, and felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was dead and buried. "This is crazy," he said finally. "Yes." Ayana agreed with a smile that transformed her entire face. "But sometimes, the best things in life are crazy." Nietzsche stepped forward, his expression formal. "Ezra Blackwood, I offer you the hand of my sister in marriage, along with alliance with the Chiricahua Apache and the protection of our warriors. In return, you would provide for her, protect her, and honor the traditions of our people. And if I refuse, then you refuse," Nietzsche said with a shrug. "We are not slavers or raiders. We do not force marriage on unwilling people." "But," he glanced at his sister, who was watching Ezra with an expression of hopeful vulnerability that was at odds with her warrior's bearing, "I think you would be foolish to refuse. Ayana is a prize beyond measure, and she has chosen you freely." Ezra looked at the woman who had somehow turned his carefully ordered world upside down in the space of an hour. She was everything he'd never known he wanted: strong, beautiful, intelligent, brave. But she was also Apache, and he was a white man with a past full of violence and regret. The gulf between their worlds seemed impossible to bridge. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Of course," Nietzsche replied. "We will make camp here tonight. In the morning you can give us your answer." As the Apache warriors began setting up their temporary camp in his valley, Ezra found himself walking toward his cabin in a daze. Behind him, he could hear Ayana speaking with her brother in their native tongue, her voice animated and excited. What the hell had he gotten himself into? Ezra's cabin sat on a small rise overlooking the valley, positioned to provide a clear view of all approaches while remaining hidden from casual observation. It was a solid structure built from local pine logs, with a stone fireplace, glass windows he'd packed in from Denver, and all the comforts a man could want in the wilderness. As he climbed the steps to his front porch, Ezra could hear the sounds of the Apache camp being established below, the soft voices of warriors, the nickering of horses, the crackle of fires being built. It was the first time in 5 years that his valley had hosted other human beings, and the change felt both intrusive and oddly comforting. Inside the cabin, Ezra poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and settled into his favorite chair by the window. From here, he could see Ayana moving among her brother's warriors, and even at a distance, her impressive height and graceful movements were unmistakable. Married to an Apache warrior princess, he thought, taking a sip of whiskey. 5 years ago, I was killing Confederates in Virginia. Now I'm being propositioned by the daughter of Mangas Coloradas. Life sure has a way of taking unexpected turns. The truth was, Ezra had been alone for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to want companionship. After the war, after the things he'd done and seen, solitude had seemed like the only path to peace. But watching Ayana, seeing her strength, her dignity, her fierce intelligence had awakened something in him that he'd thought was permanently buried. A soft knock on his door interrupted his brooding. Ezra opened it to find Ayana standing on his porch, looking somehow even more impressive in the golden light of the setting Sunday. She'd cleaned up at the stream and braided her long black hair, and someone had given her a clean buckskin dress that fit her tall frame properly. "May I come in?" she asked. Ezra stepped aside, acutely aware of how her presence seemed to fill his cabin. She moved with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, her dark eyes taking in every detail of his living space. "You live well for a hermit," she observed, noting the books on his shelves, the quality of his furniture, the cleanliness and order of everything. "I believe in being comfortable," Ezra replied, pouring himself another whiskey. Can I offer you something? Water? Coffee? Coffee would be good. As Ezra busied himself with the coffee pot, he was hyper-aware of Ayana's presence behind him. She was examining his books, running her fingers along the leather spines with obvious appreciation. "You read Shakespeare," she said, pulling out a worn copy of Hamlet. "You know Shakespeare?" Ayana's smile was slightly mocking. "Surprised that a savage can read, white man." Ezra felt heat rise in his cheeks. "That's not what I meant, isn't it?" She opened the book to a random page and began to recite, "To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them." Her pronunciation was perfect, her understanding of the rhythm and meaning clear. "I was educated at a mission school until I was 16. The priests thought they could make me into a proper Christian lady. What happened? I grew too tall and too strong, and I asked too many questions they couldn't answer." Ayana replaced the book carefully. "They sent me back to my people, saying I was unsuitable for civilized society." Ezra handed her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Even that small contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. Their loss, perhaps? Or perhaps it was meant to be. Ayana settled into the chair across from his, her long legs folded gracefully despite her size. "Tell me about yourself, Ezra Blackwood. What brought you to these mountains?" "The war," Ezra said simply. "You fought for the Union?" "I did. Started as a private, ended as a major, saw action from Bull Run to Appomattox." He stared into his whiskey glass. "Did things that needed doing, but that doesn't make them right. You killed men. Many men. Too many men." Ezra looked up to meet her dark eyes. "I was good at it, Ayana, too good. After a while, killing becomes easy, and that's when you know you need to stop. So you came here to find peace." "I came here to hide," Ezra corrected. "There's a difference." Ayana was quiet for a moment, studying his face in the lamplight. "You think you are a bad man because you were good at war. But war is not murder, Ezra. War is survival, and sometimes survival requires terrible choices. You sound like you speak from experience." "I do. I have killed men too, Apache enemies, Mexican slavers, American soldiers who came to our lands with violence in their hearts." Her voice was matter-of-fact, without shame or boasting. "Each death was necessary, but that does not make them easy to carry." Ezra found himself leaning forward, drawn by her calm acceptance of harsh realities. "How do you live with it?" "By remembering that I am more than the worst thing I have ever done. By choosing, each day, to be the person I want to be, rather than the person my enemies would make me." She sipped her coffee, her eyes never leaving his face. "By finding someone worth living for, rather than simply existing." The implication in her words was clear, and Ezra felt his pulse quicken. "Ayana, I know this is sudden," she said, setting down her cup and leaning forward. "I know we are strangers from different worlds, but I also know what I felt when you freed me from those chains, what I see when I look into your eyes." "What do you see?" "A good man who has forgotten his own goodness, a strong man who has chosen gentleness, a lonely man who deserves to be loved." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "A man I could spend my life learning to understand." Ezra stared at her, his carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of her honesty. "You don't know what you're asking. I'm not. I don't know how to be a husband, especially to someone like you." "Someone like me? Strong, independent, magnificent." The words came out before he could stop them, and Ayana's eyes widened slightly. "You're a warrior princess, Ayana. You deserve someone who can match your strength, your courage, your ducking." "You killed 4 armed men to save a stranger," she interrupted. "You live alone in the wilderness, providing for yourself, asking nothing from anyone." You read Shakespeare and drink good whiskey and build beautiful homes with your own hands." She stood and moved closer, her impressive height allowing her to look down at him even though he remained seated. "What more strength could I ask for?" Ezra rose to face her, acutely aware of how she towered over his own considerable frame. Up close he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, smell the clean scent of her hair, feel the warmth radiating from her powerful body. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly, "about why I really came to these mountains." "Tell me." Ezra walked to the window, staring out at the Apache camp below. "The last battle I fought was at a place called Sailor's Creek, just before Lee surrendered. We overran a Confederate position, and I found myself face to face with a boy couldn't have been more than 16, wearing a uniform that was too big for him and carrying a rifle he barely knew how to use. Ayanna waited silently for him to continue. He was wounded, bleeding, probably dying already, but he still tried to fight, still tried to do his duty." Ezra's voice was barely audible. "I could have taken him prisoner. Should have taken him prisoner. Instead, I put a bullet in his head and moved on to the next position. You ended his suffering. I murdered a child because it was easier than dealing with a wounded prisoner." Ezra turned to face her, his eyes haunted. "That's the kind of man you're thinking about marrying, Ayanna. A man who kills children because it's convenient." Ayanna studied his face for a long moment, then crossed the room to stand directly in front of him. Without warning, she reached out and cupped his face in her large, gentle hands. "You have carried this guilt for 5 years," she said softly. 5 years of punishing yourself for a moment of war, for a choice made in blood and chaos and fear. How long is long enough, Ezra? How many years of loneliness will balance the scales?" "I don't know," he whispered. "Then let me help you find out." Ayanna leaned down and kissed him, her lips soft and warm against his. It was a gentle kiss, full of promise and understanding, and Ezra felt something inside him break open like a dam giving way to spring floods. When they separated, both were breathing hard. Ayanna rested her forehead against his, her dark eyes serious. "Marry me, Ezra Blackwood," she said simply. "Not because Apache law demands it, not because you feel obligated, but because we could be good together, because we could heal each other's wounds and build something beautiful in this valley." Ezra looked into her eyes and saw his future, not the lonely, guilt-ridden existence he'd been living, but something bright and full of possibility. It terrified him and thrilled him in equal measure. "Yes," he said, the word coming out as barely more than a breath. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ayanna's smile was like sunrise over the mountains, transforming her entire face with joy and relief. "You will not regret this choice," she said, kissing him again with more passion than before. "I hope not," Ezra replied, pulling her closer and marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms despite their size difference. "I really hope not." Outside, the Apache camp had settled into evening quiet, but Ezra barely noticed. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't thinking about the past or dreading the future. He was simply present in the moment, holding a remarkable woman who had somehow seen past his guilt and loneliness to the man he could still become. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, cultural differences to navigate, a marriage to plan, a life to build together. But tonight, in the warm glow of his cabin with Ayanna in his arms, Ezra Blackwood allowed himself to believe in the possibility of happiness. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the grass, and the peaks surrounding the valley touched with gold. Ezra woke early, as was his habit, and found Ayanna already up and moving around his kitchen with the easy confidence of a woman comfortable in any environment. "You cook?" he asked, noting the smell of bacon and coffee filling the cabin. "I do many things," she replied with a smile that made his pulse quicken. A warrior must be self-sufficient. They ate breakfast together in comfortable silence, both aware that this simple domestic scene was a preview of the life they were choosing to build together. When they finished, Ayanna stood and smoothed down her buckskin dress. "It is time to speak with my brother," she said, "to make the arrangements official." Ezra nodded, suddenly nervous about facing Nietzsche and the other Apache warriors. In the clear light of morning, his decision to marry into an Apache family seemed both inevitable and completely insane. They walked down to the camp together, and Ezra was struck by how natural it felt to have Ayanna beside him. Her presence was both calming and energizing, like walking next to a force of nature that had chosen to be benevolent. Nietzsche was waiting for them beside the central fire, his expression unreadable as he watched their approach. The other warriors had formed a loose circle around the fire, their dark eyes curious but respectful. "Brother," Ayanna said in English, clearly wanting Ezra to understand every word. "Ezra Blackwood has agreed to marry me." Nietzsche's stern expression broke into a genuine smile. "This is good news, sister. And you, white man, you understand what you are agreeing to?" "I'm beginning to," Ezra replied honestly, "though I suspect I'll be learning for the rest of my life." "Marriage is always a learning experience," Nietzsche said with what might have been amusement. "But marriage to my sister will be educational in ways you cannot imagine." Several of the warriors chuckled at this, and Ezra got the distinct impression there was a joke he wasn't getting. Ayanna shot her brother a warning look that only made him grin wider. "When will the ceremony take place?" Nietzsche asked. "As soon as possible," Ayanna replied. "There is no reason to wait. Today, then. We will perform the traditional Apache ceremony, and you can have whatever white man's ceremony you wish later." Nietzsche's expression grew more serious. "But first, there are things that must be discussed. Obligations and expectations that come with marrying into our family." For the next hour, Ezra received an intensive education in Apache marriage customs, family obligations, and cultural expectations. He learned that as Ayanna's husband, he would be considered a member of the tribe, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. He would be expected to provide for not just his wife, but potentially for her extended family in times of need. He would be called upon to fight alongside Apache warriors if the tribe was threatened. Most importantly, he learned that Ayanna was not just any Apache woman, but a keeper of ancient traditions and sacred knowledge. Her children would be raised in both worlds, Apache and white, and would be expected to serve as bridges between the two cultures. "This is a great responsibility," Nietzsche said seriously. "Are you prepared for it?" Ezra looked at Ayanna, seeing the hope and trust in her dark eyes. "I'll do my best to be worthy of it." That is all anyone can ask. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Ezra had ever experienced. It took place at sunset, with the entire war party gathered in a circle around a sacred fire that Ayanna had built using traditional methods. She had changed into an elaborate dress of white buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork and silver ornaments, and her long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers and turquoise jewelry. Ezra had been given traditional Apache clothing as well, buckskin pants and shirt, moccasins, and a headband decorated with symbols he didn't recognize but somehow felt honored to wear. The ceremony involved prayers in Apache, the sharing of sacred foods, and rituals that seemed to connect the participants to the land, the sky, and the spirits of their ancestors. Ezra understood perhaps half of what was happening, but he felt the power and meaning in every gesture, every word. When Nietzsche finally pronounced them husband and wife, according to Apache law, Ayanna turned to Ezra with tears of joy in her eyes. She was so beautiful in that moment, tall and proud and radiant with happiness, that Ezra felt his breath catch in his throat. "My husband," she said softly, the words carrying the weight of promise and commitment. "My wife," he replied, and kissed her as the Apache warriors raised their voices in celebration. Later, as the wedding feast continued around the fire and the warriors shared stories and songs, Ezra found himself sitting beside his new wife and marveling at the turn his life had taken. 24 hours ago, he'd been a hermit living alone in the mountains. Now he was married to an Apache warrior princess and officially adopted into one of the most feared tribes in the Southwest. Any regrets? Ayanna asked quietly, her hand finding his in the firelight. Ezra looked around at the celebration, at the faces of warriors who had accepted him as family, at the woman beside him who had somehow seen past his guilt and loneliness to the man he could still become. None, he said, and meant it completely. But even as he spoke the words, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. Marriage was one thing. Building a life together across the vast cultural divide between their worlds would be something else entirely. Still, as Ayanna leaned against his shoulder and the Apache drums echoed off the valley walls, Ezra Blackwood allowed himself to hope that love might be strong enough to bridge any gap, overcome any obstacle. He was about to find out just how strong love could be. 3 weeks into their marriage, Ezra was beginning to understand what Nietzsche had meant about the experience being educational. Living with Ayanna was like sharing his cabin with a force of nature, beautiful, powerful, and utterly unpredictable. She rose before dawn each morning to perform what she called her warrior's prayers, a series of physical and spiritual exercises that left her glowing with energy and ready to tackle whatever the day might bring. She hunted with a skill that put his own considerable abilities to shame, bringing down elk and deer with a bow that looked like a child's toy in her powerful hands. She could track a mouse through fresh snow, start a fire in a rainstorm, and cook meals that made his previous bachelor fare seem like pig slop. But it was the nights that truly amazed him. In the privacy of their bedroom, the fierce Apache warrior became something else entirely tender, passionate, vulnerable in ways that took his breath away. She would trace the scars on his body with gentle fingers, listening as he told her the story behind each one, offering comfort for wounds both physical and emotional. "You carry too much guilt, husband," she said one evening as they lay entwined before the fireplace. "It will poison your spirit if you let it." "Some things can't be forgiven," Ezra replied, his fingers combing through her long black hair. "All things can be forgiven, if we choose to forgive ourselves." Ayanna propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "Among my people, we have a ceremony for warriors who return from battle, carrying the weight of necessary killing. It cleanses the spirit, allows the warrior to return to the tribe whole. I'm not Apache. You are now. You are my husband, adopted into the Chiricahua. The ceremony is yours by right if you want it." Ezra considered this, feeling something stir in his chest that might have been hope. What would it involve? Fasting, prayer, ritual cleansing, the guidance of a medicine man who understands the warrior's burden. Ayanna's dark eyes were serious. "It would not erase what you have done, but it would help you find peace with it." Before Ezra could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the valley. Both of them were instantly alert. Years of frontier living, having taught them that unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. "How many?" Ayanna asked, already reaching for her weapons. Ezra listened carefully to the rhythm of hoofbeats. 6, maybe 8 riders, coming fast. They dressed quickly and armed themselves, Ezra with his rifle and revolver, Ayanna with her bow and the wicked-looking knife she wore at her hip. By the time they reached the front porch, the riders were close enough to identify. "White men," Ayanna said, her voice tight with tension. "Soldiers, by the look of them." Ezra cursed under his breath. He'd been hoping his marriage to Ayanna could remain a private matter, at least for a while. But news traveled fast in the territory, and it seemed word had reached the wrong ears. The patrol consisted of 8 cavalry troopers, led by a young lieutenant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. They rode into the valley with weapons ready, their eyes taking in the scene with obvious suspicion. "You Ezra Blackwood?" the lieutenant called out, his voice cracking slightly with nervousness. "I am. What can I do for you, Lieutenant?" "Lieutenant James Morrison, 3rd Cavalry Regiment. I'm here on orders from Colonel Harrison at Fort Craig." Morrison's eyes flicked to Ayanna, and Ezra saw him swallow hard at the sight of the tall Apache woman standing beside him. We've received reports that you're harboring a hostile Indian, possibly involved in recent raids on settlements south of here. The only Indian here is my wife, Ezra said calmly, and she's not hostile to anyone who doesn't threaten her first. Your wife? Morrison's voice rose an octave. Sir, you can't be serious. Marriage between whites and Indians is legal under territorial law, Ezra interrupted. I checked before I said my vows. But sir, this woman is Apache. The Chiricahua are at war with the United States government. Some Chiricahua are at war, Ayanna said, speaking for the first time. Her English was perfect, her tone coldly polite. I am not. I am married to this man according to both Apache and territorial law. I have committed no crimes against your people. Morrison stared at her, clearly struggling to process the sight of a 6.5-foot Apache woman speaking perfect English and claiming to be legally married to a white man. Ma'am, he said finally, I'm going to need you to come with us for questioning. There are reports of Apache raids, and no. Ezra's voice was flat and final. My wife isn't going anywhere with you. Sir, I have my orders. Your orders don't extend to harassing law-abiding citizens on their own property. Ezra stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his revolver. This is my land, Lieutenant. My wife is under my protection. If you want to question her, you can do it right here, right now, with me present. Morrison looked around at his men, clearly out of his depth. He was young, probably fresh from West Point, and this situation wasn't covered in any manual he'd studied. What raids are you investigating? Ayanna asked, her tone still polite but with an edge that suggested her patience was wearing thin. 3 settlements hit in the past month, Morrison replied. Livestock stolen, buildings burned, 2 men killed. Witnesses described a war party of Chiricahua Apache. Described how? What did they see? Morrison consulted a paper from his pocket. War paint, traditional weapons, the usual Apache tactics. Ayanna and Ezra exchanged glances. Something about this didn't sound right. Lieutenant, Ayanna said carefully, what time of day did these raids occur? Daylight hours mostly. Why? Because Apache war parties don't raid in daylight unless they're desperate or stupid. We prefer dawn or dusk attacks, when the light favors us. Ayanna's eyes narrowed. And we don't paint for war when conducting simple raids. War paint is for battles, not cattle theft. Are you saying these weren't Apache raids? I'm saying they weren't conducted by real Apache warriors. Someone is trying very hard to make you think they were. Morrison looked confused. Who would do that? Someone who benefits from increased military action against the Apache, Ezra said grimly. Someone who wants the cavalry stirred up and looking for Indians to fight. Before Morrison could respond, one of his troopers called out from the edge of the camp. Lieutenant, you need to see this. They all walked over to where the trooper was examining the ground near the stream. Even Ezra could see the tracks clearly: unshod horses, moccasin prints, the remains of a campfire that was several weeks old. Apache sign, the trooper said confidently. Recent, too. Ayanna knelt beside the tracks, studying them with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. After a moment, she stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. These tracks are from my brother's war party, she said simply. They camped here 3 weeks ago for my wedding ceremony. Your wedding? Morrison's voice was faint. 24 Chiricahua warriors attended my marriage to Ezra Blackwood. They stayed one night, then returned to their territory. Ayanna's smile was sharp as a blade. Would you like me to name each warrior who was present? Describe their horses, their weapons, their individual fighting styles? Morrison stared at her, clearly realizing he was dealing with someone far more knowledgeable than he'd expected. That won't be necessary, ma'am. Good. Now, about these raids you're investigating, I suggest you look for white men disguised as Apache. Check the local trading posts for anyone buying war paint, feathers, traditional weapons. Look for men with military training who know Apache tactics but not Apache customs. Why would white men disguise themselves as Apache? Land, Ezra said grimly. There's always someone looking to grab territory, and nothing clears out settlers faster than Indian raids. Create enough fear, and people will abandon their claims. Then someone swoops in to buy the land cheap. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he nodded slowly. It makes sense. We've had reports of land speculators in the area, men offering to buy out settlers at below-market prices. There's your answer, Ayanna said. Find the speculators, and you'll find your fake Apache raiders. The young lieutenant looked embarrassed. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I came here expecting to arrest a hostile Indian, and instead I find a woman who may have just solved our case. Apology accepted, Lieutenant, but in the future you might want to investigate before you accuse. As the cavalry patrol prepared to leave, Morrison approached Ezra privately. Sir, I have to ask, are you sure about this marriage? I mean, she's impressive, but the cultural differences. Ezra looked back at his wife, who was efficiently cleaning her weapons while keeping one eye on the departing soldiers. Even performing such a mundane task, she radiated strength and competence. Lieutenant, he said quietly, 3 weeks ago I was a lonely hermit, living in the mountains with nothing but guilt and regret for company. Now I'm married to the most remarkable woman I've ever met, and for the first time in years, I'm looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it. Cultural differences seem like a pretty small price to pay for that. Morrison nodded, though he still looked doubtful. Well, sir, I wish you luck. You're going to need it. After the soldiers left, Ezra and Ayanna sat on their front porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The encounter had been unsettling. A reminder that their marriage existed in a world that wasn't always accepting of such unions. They'll be back, Ayanna said quietly. Maybe not those soldiers, but others. There will always be people who see our marriage as wrong, dangerous, unnatural. Are you having second thoughts? Ayanna turned to look at him, her dark eyes serious. Are you? Ezra considered the question honestly. The past 3 weeks had been the happiest of his adult life, but he wasn't naive about the challenges they faced. Their marriage was legal but controversial, accepted by Apache law but viewed with suspicion by white society. They would face prejudice, hostility, and constant scrutiny from both sides. No, he said finally, no second thoughts. But I want you to know what you're signing up for. Life with me isn't going to be easy, Ayanna. We'll always be outsiders, always having to prove ourselves, always fighting for acceptance. Good, she said with a fierce smile. I've never been interested in easy. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the night sounds of their valley, Ayanna spoke into the darkness. Ezra? I want to tell you something about my visions, about why I knew you were meant to be my husband. Ezra turned to face her, seeing her profile silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through their window. What did you see? Children, she said softly. Strong, beautiful children who will grow up to be bridges between our peoples. I saw a school where Apache and white children learn together, where the old ways and the new ways meet and create something better than either alone. You saw all that? I saw possibility. I saw hope. Ayanna turned to meet his eyes. I saw a future worth fighting for. Ezra pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms despite their size difference. Then that's what we'll build. Together. Together, she agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of forever. But even as they held each other in the darkness, both knew that building their dream would require more than love and good intentions. It would require courage, determination, and the strength to stand against a world that wasn't ready for what they represented. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, a lone Apache warrior riding hard into their valley with news that would change everything. Naiche sends word, the warrior said in rapid Apache, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. The blue coats are coming. Many soldiers, with orders to round up all Apache and take them to the reservation. They will be here within 2 days. Ayanna translated for Ezra, her face grave. My brother warns us to flee, to come to the hidden canyon where the tribe is gathering for the final resistance. Ezra felt his blood run cold. He'd known this day might come. The government's patience with free Apache was wearing thin, and there had been increasing pressure to force all tribes onto reservations. But he'd hoped they would have more time. What do you want to do? He asked his wife. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley they'd begun to call home. If I go with my people, I become a fugitive. If I stay here, I become a prisoner on the reservation if they don't simply kill me as a hostile. There's a third option, Ezra said quietly, which is, we fight, not as Apache or white, but as Americans defending our home and our rights. We make them prove their authority, challenge them in court if necessary. Ayanna looked at him with something that might have been admiration. You would do that? Risk everything to stand with me? I would do anything to stand with you, Ezra replied. The question is whether you're willing to trust the white man's law to protect us. Ayanna smiled, and in that smile Ezra saw the fierce warrior princess who had captured his heart. I trust you, husband, and if you believe we can fight this legally, then that's what we'll do. It won't be easy. We'll need lawyers, witnesses, documentation, and even then there's no guarantee. Nothing worthwhile is ever guaranteed, Ayanna said, taking his hand in hers. But some things are worth fighting for, no matter the odds. As the Apache messenger rode away to carry their decision back to Naiche, Ezra and Ayanna began preparing for the battle of their lives, not with weapons and war paint, but with law books and legal precedents, fighting for the right to live as they chose in the land they loved. It would be their greatest test yet, and the outcome would determine not just their own future, but the future of the children Ayanna had seen in her visions, the bridges between worlds who might one day heal the wounds between their peoples. The war for their hearts was over. The war for their future was about to begin. The cavalry arrived at dawn on the second day, just as the Apache messenger had predicted. Ezra counted at least 50 soldiers spread across the valley floor, with more positioned on the surrounding ridges, enough firepower to level his cabin and everyone in it if things went badly. At their head rode a man Ezra recognized from wanted posters and newspaper accounts, Colonel Marcus Whitman, known throughout the territory as the Apache Hunter. Whitman was a career soldier with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and a personal hatred of all things Apache, stemming from a raid that had killed his family years earlier. Ezra Blackwood, Whitman's voice carried clearly across the valley. By order of the territorial governor and the United States Army, you will surrender the Apache woman known as Ayanna for transport to the Bosque Redondo Reservation. Ezra stepped onto his front porch, Ayanna beside him, both of them armed but not threatening. Colonel Whitman, he called back, the woman you're referring to is my wife, legally married under territorial law. She's committed no crimes and has no obligation to report to any reservation. Whitman spurred his horse closer, his weathered face twisted with disgust as he took in the sight of the tall Apache woman standing proudly beside her white husband. Marriage between whites and savages is an abomination, Blackwood. It won't be recognized by this command. It's recognized by the territorial courts, Ezra replied calmly, pulling a folded document from his shirt pocket. I have the marriage certificate right here, properly filed and witnessed. I don't care if you have a letter from President Grant himself, Whitman snarled. That woman is Apache, and all Apache belong on the reservation. She comes with us, or we take her by force. Ayanna stepped forward, her impressive height allowing her to look down at the mounted colonel with regal disdain. I am Ayanna, daughter of Mangus Coloradas, wife of Ezra Blackwood, and citizen of the Colorado Territory by marriage. I have committed no crimes against the United States government. By what authority do you claim the right to imprison me? Whitman's face flushed red with anger. By the authority of superior firepower, you red bitch. You've got 1 minute to come down here peacefully, or my men start shooting. Colonel, Ezra said, his voice carrying the flat, dangerous tone of a man who'd killed before and would kill again. If you threaten my wife again, we're going to have a problem that won't be solved by talking. You're outnumbered 50-2, Blackwood. What exactly do you think you can do? Ezra smiled, and there was nothing pleasant about the expression. I can kill you before your men know what's happening. My wife can put an arrow through your heart from this distance faster than you can blink. We might not survive what comes after, but you definitely won't. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 50 soldiers with rifles trained on 2 people who showed no sign of backing down. Whitman's hand moved toward his sidearm, and Ezra could feel Ayanna tensing beside him, ready to draw her bow. Then, unexpectedly, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the tension. A small group of riders was approaching from the south, not soldiers, but civilians, led by a man in a black suit who rode with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "Colonel Whitman," the man in the suit called out as he rode into the valley. "Stand down your men immediately." Whitman turned in his saddle, his face darkening further. "Judge Morrison, what the hell are you doing here?" Judge Harrison Morrison. Lieutenant Morrison's father, as it turned out, was the territorial judge for this district, a man known for his fairness and strict adherence to the law. He was accompanied by 2 lawyers, a court clerk, and a small escort of federal marshals. "I'm here to prevent you from making a catastrophic legal error, Colonel," Morrison said as he dismounted. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood are under the protection of a federal court order, issued this morning in response to a writ of habeas corpus filed by their attorney." "Their attorney?" Whitman looked confused. One of the lawyers stepped forward, a distinguished man with silver hair and expensive clothes. "Jonathan Hartwell, Colonel of Hartwell Patterson Associates. I represent Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood in this matter." Ezra stared at the lawyer in amazement. He'd never seen the man before in his life, had no idea how he'd even learned about their situation, much less why he'd be willing to represent them. "I don't understand," Ezra said. "I never hired a lawyer." Hartwell smiled. "Your case was brought to my attention by some mutual friends, Mr. Blackwood. Friends who believe very strongly in the principles of justice and equal treatment under the law." Before Ezra could ask what friends he meant, another group of riders appeared at the valley's entrance. This time it was Apache Nietzsche and a dozen of his finest warriors, riding in battle formation with weapons ready. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. 50 cavalry soldiers, a dozen Apache warriors, federal marshals, lawyers, and a territorial judge, all converging on Ezra's peaceful valley like opposing armies preparing for war. "This is getting complicated," Ayanna murmured. "That's an understatement," Ezra replied. Judge Morrison took charge of the situation with the authority of his office. "Colonel Whitman, I'm ordering you to withdraw your men to a safe distance while we sort this out legally. Mr. Nye, I assume you're here in support of your sister?" Nietzsche rode forward, his bearing proud and dignified despite being surrounded by enemies. "I am here to ensure that my sister's rights are respected, Judge Morrison. She is married according to both Apache and white law. She has committed no crimes. There is no legal basis for her arrest." "The Apache are at war with the United States," Whitman protested. "All Apache are enemy combatants subject to military detention." "Some Apache are at war," Judge Morrison corrected. "But Mrs. Blackwood has renounced her tribal citizenship through marriage and is now a citizen of the Colorado Territory. She cannot be held responsible for the actions of other Apache any more than you could be held responsible for the actions of other white men." Hartwell stepped forward with a thick folder of documents. "Your Honor, I have here a complete legal brief outlining Mrs. Blackwood's status under territorial and federal law. Her marriage is valid, her citizenship is legitimate, and any attempt to forcibly relocate her would constitute kidnapping under territorial statute." Whitman's face was purple with rage. This is ridiculous. She's a savage, a potential spy, a threat to every white settlement in the territory. She's also the woman who helped solve the case of the fake Apache raids, Judge Morrison said dryly. My son's report makes it clear that Mrs. Blackwood's assistance was instrumental in identifying the real culprits, white men disguising themselves as Apache to drive settlers off valuable land. That's impossible. The men were arrested yesterday, Morrison continued. 3 land speculators and 2 hired guns caught red-handed with Apache disguises and stolen cattle. They've confessed to staging the raids that prompted your current campaign, Colonel. The wind went out of Whitman's sails as he realized his justification for the operation had just evaporated. But his hatred of Apache ran too deep for logic or law to overcome. I don't care about legal technicalities, he snarled. That woman is Apache, and I won't have Apache running free in my territory. It's not your territory, Colonel, Judge Morrison said firmly. It's United States territory, governed by United States law. And under that law, Mrs. Blackwood has every right to live here with her husband. Then the law is wrong. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Ezra could see the moment when Whitman realized he'd gone too far. A career military officer had just declared his intention to ignore federal law in front of a territorial judge and a dozen witnesses. Colonel Whitman, Judge Morrison said in a voice cold as winter wind, you are hereby relieved of command pending a full investigation into your conduct. Major Patterson, you will assume command of this unit and withdraw immediately to Fort Craig. Whitman's second-in-command, a competent-looking man in his 40s, saluted crisply. Yes, sir. Colonel Whitman, sir, I'll need your sidearm and insignia. For a moment, it looked like Whitman might resist. His hand moved toward his gun, and Ezra tensed, ready to protect his wife from a man whose hatred had finally driven him over the edge of sanity. But Whitman was still enough of a soldier to recognize when he was beaten. With visible reluctance, he handed over his weapons and rank insignia, his face a mask of bitter defeat. This isn't over, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on Ayanna with undisguised malice. Laws can be changed. Judges can be replaced. Sooner or later, I'll see every Apache in chains or in the ground. Threats against federal officials and private citizens, Judge Morrison noted to his clerk, add that to the charges. As Whitman was led away under guard and the cavalry withdrew from the valley, Ezra felt like he could breathe again for the first time in days. But he still had questions that needed answers. Mr. Hartwell, he said, approaching the lawyer who had appeared like a guardian angel, I appreciate your help, but I have to ask who hired you, and how did you know we needed representation? Hartwell smiled and gestured toward the group of Apache warriors. Your brother-in-law is a very resourceful man, Mr. Blackwood. When he learned of the military's plans, he rode to Santa Fe and contacted certain sympathetic parties who believe in justice for all peoples. Sympathetic parties? Let's just say there are more people in high places who support Apache rights than you might expect. People who believe that the only way to achieve lasting peace is through justice and mutual respect, not through force and oppression. Nietzsche rode over to join the conversation, his stern face showing the first hint of a smile Ezra had seen. My sister chose well when she chose you, white man. You stood ready to die for her, even against impossible odds. She's my wife, Ezra said simply. That's what husbands do. Not all husbands, Ayanna said softly, taking his hand in hers. Not even all Apache husbands would have stood against 50 soldiers for their wives. Judge Morrison approached with his official documents. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, I'm issuing a permanent injunction against any further military harassment. You're free to live here in peace, with the full protection of territorial and federal law. Thank you, Your Honor, Ezra said. But what about the other Apache? The ones who aren't protected by marriage to white citizens? Morrison's expression grew somber. That's a larger question, Mr. Blackwood, one that will require changes in federal policy, not just territorial law. But perhaps your marriage, your success in bridging two worlds will serve as an example of what's possible when people choose understanding over hatred. As the various officials and their escorts prepared to leave the valley, Hartwell pulled Ezra aside for a private conversation. "Mr. Blackwood, my clients, the people who funded your legal defense, have a proposition for you and your wife." "What kind of proposition?" "They want to establish a school here in your valley. A place where Apache and white children can learn together, where the barriers between cultures can be broken down through education and understanding." Ezra felt his pulse quicken. It was exactly what Ayanna had envisioned in her dreams, the future she'd seen in her visions. What would that involve? Funding for buildings, supplies, teacher salaries, legal protection for the school and its students, political support at the territorial and federal level. Hartwell's eyes were serious. "It would be controversial, Mr. Blackwood. You'd face opposition from both sides, whites who don't want their children educated alongside Apache who don't trust white education. But it could also be the beginning of real change in this territory. I'll need to discuss it with my wife." "Of course, take your time. But remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns and soldiers, but with books and ideas." That evening, as the last of their unexpected visitors departed and peace returned to the valley, Ezra and Ayanna sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "So," Ezra said, "what do you think about this school idea?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes distant as she considered the possibilities. "It's what I saw in my visions," she said finally. "Children of both peoples learning together, building bridges between worlds. But it won't be easy, husband. We'll face hatred from both sides, people who see our dream as a threat to their way of life. Are you willing to try?" Ayanna turned to look at him, her face radiant with hope and determination. "I married a man who was willing to stand against 50 soldiers to protect me. I think I can handle a few angry parents and school board meetings." Ezra laughed, pulling her closer. "When you put it that way, it sounds almost easy." "Nothing about our life together will ever be easy," Ayanna said, settling against his warmth. "But it will be worth it. Every challenge, every battle, every moment of doubt, it will all be worth it if we can build something lasting, something that makes the world better for the children who come after us." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ezra reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely hermit hiding from his past. Now he was married to an extraordinary woman, legally protected by territorial law, and on the verge of starting a school that could change the future of the entire region. "Ayanna?" "Yes, husband? I love you. More than I ever thought possible. More than I have words to express." "I love you too," she replied, kissing him softly. "And I love the future we're going to build together." 6 months later, the Blackwood School for All Children opened its doors for the first time. The building was beautiful, constructed of local stone and timber, with large windows that looked out over the valley and the mountains beyond. Apache and white children sat side by side in the classrooms, learning, reading and writing and arithmetic, but also learning about each other's cultures, languages, and traditions. Ayanna proved to be a natural teacher, her combination of intelligence, patience, and quiet authority making her beloved by students of all backgrounds. Ezra handled the administrative duties and taught practical skills, carpentry, farming, basic engineering, while also serving as the school's protector and advocate. The opposition they'd expected materialized quickly. Angry parents, hostile newspaper editorials, threats from extremists on both sides who saw the integrated school as an abomination. But they also found unexpected support from progressive educators, from Apache leaders who saw the value of their children learning white ways, from white families who recognized that the future belonged to those who could build bridges rather than walls. On a crisp autumn morning, as Ezra watched his wife teaching a mixed class of Apache and white children about the constellations visible in the night sky, he marveled at how far they'd come. The lonely, guilt-ridden hermit who had saved a chained Apache woman from slave traders had become a husband, a teacher, a pillar of his community. "Mr. Blackwood?" A small voice interrupted his thoughts. Little Sarah Running Bear, the daughter of one of Nietzsche's warriors, was tugging at his sleeve. "Mrs. Blackwood says to tell you the baby is coming." Ezra's heart stopped. Ayanna was 6 months pregnant with their first child, but it was too early. He rushed into the classroom to find his wife calmly finishing her lesson despite the obvious signs of labor beginning. When she saw him, she smiled with the serene confidence that had first captured his heart. "It's time, husband," she said simply. The birth was difficult. Ayanna's size worked against her in some ways, and the baby was large even by Blackwood's standards. But when their son finally arrived, red-faced and squalling with indignation at being forced into the world, Ezra felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. "He's perfect," he whispered, cradling the infant in his large hands. "He's ours," Ayanna replied, exhausted but radiant with joy. "The first of the bridge builders I saw in my visions." They named him Thomas Mangus Blackwood Thomas for Ezra's father, Mangus for Ayanna's grandfather, Blackwood for the family they were creating together. He would grow up speaking both English and Apache, learning the ways of both peoples, comfortable in both worlds. As Ezra held his son and watched his wife recover from the ordeal of birth, he thought about the incredible chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter with slave traders, a desperate fight, a marriage born of necessity that had become the greatest love of his life. "What are you thinking about?" Ayanna asked softly. "Destiny," Ezra replied. "Whether we choose our fate or it chooses us. Does it matter? We're here, we're together, we're building something beautiful." Ayanna reached out to touch their son's tiny hand. The how matters less than the what. Outside their window, the sounds of the school day continued, children laughing, learning, playing together without regard for the color of their skin or the culture of their birth. It was the sound of the future, the sound of hope made manifest. And in the distance, barely audible on the mountain wind, came the sound of Apache drums carrying news across the territory. News of a white man and an Apache woman who had defied the odds, overcome every obstacle, and built a love strong enough to change the world. The story of Ezra and Ayanna Blackwood had become legend, told around campfires and in trading posts throughout the Southwest, a tale of love found in the most unlikely circumstances, of courage tested and proven true, and of the power of two hearts united to build bridges across the deepest divides. But for Ezra, holding his wife and son as the Colorado sun set over their valley, it wasn't a legend at all. It was simply home.